And I'm not going to go into the huge philosophical discourse on this, and certainly not the legal discourse. But we recognize that we have rights insofar as ... Right? You have the right to speech insofar as your right to speech doesn't incite, mass violence. You have the right to speech, but you can't yell out fire in a crowded movie theater. You have the right to bear arms, provided that your right to bear arms doesn't infringe on the life of another human being in the pursuit of whatever it is that you're pursuing. Right? You can use it in self-defense, but not in these mechanisms. Right? So the idea is that our rights are always, in some sense, limited. The question then becomes, are there really rights? And I do know that I'm going to have some pretty hardcore philosophers watching this video, and they're going to argue immediately that there really is no such thing as rights. I mean, there's a huge philosophical discourse and tradition that categorically deny the existence of rights. I recognize fully that, because this is the analysis that Motto presents, that Motto doesn't challenge the conception of the existence of rights. He assumes the existence of rights, and thus I'm going to presuppose, let's just say, as I'm asking for you to be charitable, that rights do exist. Then this particular type of right, the right to suicide, how do we conceptualize limiting that potential right that we've already recognized? And what's important to know is the relationship between two things, right? Anytime we're talking about rights, we are also talking about a corresponding relationship, and that is the relationship to duties. Right? Anytime we're talking about rights, we're talking about a corresponding relationship to duties. Right? So the idea is, so what I'm going to do now is transpose this image here. If we're talking about, and I'm just going to abbreviate it, RTS, right to suicide. If we're saying an individual has a right to suicide, and we recognize that anytime we have rights, there are corresponding duties, generally speaking, presupposing the existence of rights, then if an individual has a right to suicide, then the individual must obligate a sense of duty to the establishment, right? So that they're to the institution, as Motto says, right? Anytime an individual claims to have a right to suicide, then there is an obligation, right? There's an obligation to respect or recognize that right to suicide. If an individual has a right to suicide, and since anytime we have rights, there is a corresponding duty, then insofar as this individual has those rights, there is an obligation by the institution, by the establishment, by society, by medical practitioners, by what have you, to obligate themselves as individuals and as institutions to respect and recognize the right to suicide. Now, this becomes the very point of contention. This is exactly the point of contention. Because the idea is, yes, I recognize that you have a right to suicide. And insofar as that right to suicide manifests itself, you exercise that right individually, meaning that, and I'm not going to get graphic here, but you go about taking the necessary measures in order to commit suicide, to kill yourself. Well, you've exercised that right as an individual. However, if your right to suicide obligates an institution to assist you, or obligates a spouse or a lover, or what have you, a family member, to assist you in terms of assisted suicide, or what's known as mercy killings, to assist you in your right to suicide, how do we conceptualize that, right? Because there seems to be at least two levels in which we can talk about that, right? An individual has, if you grant that there are rights, and you grant that an individual has a right to suicide, then we recognize that in terms of the act of committing suicide, there's at least, and there's many more, right? But there's at least, grossly speaking, generally speaking, two levels. One level is an individual exercising that right to suicide by him or herself, so that the individual takes the onus of taking his or her own life by themselves and commits the act by him or herself. There's a second layer to it where the individual goes to another individual or goes to an institution and asks the institution or another individual to assist him or herself, for whatever reasons, in committing and exercising the act of suicide. While individuals will recognize an ability for an individual to take his or her own life and say, yes, I will grant that, it's more difficult for us as a social cohesive unit, and I don't mean American social, I mean global social, as a global society, to legitimately acknowledge an individual's right to obligate another person in their own death. Right? How do you obligate someone in your own death? And obviously, and I'm not going to go into this because I've already gone into euthanasia. Jack Kevorkian's the whole dilemma, the whole drama that arose out of Jack Kevorkian's acts is precisely the point, right? How can an individual legitimately obligate the medical institution in assisting him or herself in taking their own life? And the argument, I'm not going to go into there, people say, well, you know, there are mechanisms within the medical community that already are functional in the termination of life to various degrees. I don't want to get into that too much because it's a really, really hot topic. And thus, the institutions already has conceptual mechanisms and practical mechanisms and even legal mechanisms in place to assist in the termination of life. This is just yet another type of life-ending procedure that the medical establishment could easily absorb, and there's a bit of contention there. But what's important to recognize is that the individual has a right, but despite the fact that the individual has the right, what becomes the problem sorry about that beat, but what becomes a potential problem is the obligation. The obligation comes in terms of the dutiful relationship that is sort of inherently attached to rights, presupposing rights, right? So that when we talk about rights, we talk about the deontological relationship, deontological meaning duty-based, right? We talk about the deontological obligations related to those rights. And despite the fact that an individual might have a right to suicide, the question is, does that right legitimately obligate others to recognize, to accept, and to respect that right? Right? And this is the point of contention from an intellectual level, aside from the obvious emotional turmoil that all of this causes. I'm not a psychologist, so I want to stay away from the emotional aspects and situate the discourse more in conceptual means. Okay, number 2. When the right is exercised, right, how can we eliminate the social stigma attached to it, right? It's a direct quote. When an actual person kills him or herself, how can we eliminate the social stigma? So, can we eliminate the stigma? Can we eliminate the stigma of suicide? The stigma of suicide is simple, and I want to be frank here. Again, noting the disclaimer that I said in the beginning. I'm not going to use names, but my friend in undergrad, when I first started my education at University of South Florida, we had completed our first year, and I think we were beginning the summer of our second year. And I knew him very, very well. He was a social, sort of outcast, introverted personality type. Everybody would be going out to the club and partying, and he and I found ourselves being disengaged and, you know, staying in the suite studying for exams. So I got to know him very well because our personalities sort of gelled. For him to kill himself, it's like, you know, who am I? I know you don't know me, per se, but you've deprived me. You've deprived other people of your existence. So one aspect, and I'm not going to say the greatest aspect of, because there's another one, but one aspect at a very, very foundational level of suicide has to do with the idea of deprivation. Right? So the first thing that we want to look at is the notion of deprivation. Right? The idea of deprivation is that